Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down complex topics by going straight to the source material. Today, we're digging into the turbulent history between the United States and Iran, a relationship that somehow went from being close friends to outright enemies at war.
So, let's set the scene. It's the early morning hours, and a conflict that's been simmering for decades finally and violently boils over. According to the sources, this is the day the long shadow war between the US and Iran just explodes into the open.
And then we get the confirmation. Operation Epic Fury is a go. The United States, working in a joint operation with Israel, launches this massive, coordinated attack on strategic sites all across Iran. The mission's goal is to be a decisive, crippling first blow.
The stated goal is, well, it's audacious. Regime change. And that initial blow is absolutely devastating. They decapitate the Iranian government by assassinating the supreme leader. The news sends shockwaves across the entire globe and throws the Middle East into total chaos.
It's a shocking turn of events, for sure. But if you've been following the history, maybe it's not entirely surprising. To really understand how we got to this point, we have to rewind the clock, way back before any bombs started falling, to a time when things looked very, very different.
Okay, let's dive into that history. And this part might actually surprise you. For nearly a full century, many Iranians saw the United States as a trusted ally. They were seen as a sort of third force that could help them push back against British and Russian imperial ambitions in their country.
And this timeline really tells the story. For decades, things were pretty positive. You had Americans helping to modernize Iran's finances, even its first modern medical school. You even had President Roosevelt himself at the Tehran Conference promising to protect Iran's sovereignty. But then you get to 1953, and in 1953, everything changed.
This single event is what foreign policy experts now call blowback. Basically, Prime Minister Mossadegh decided to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and that was a line the US and Britain wouldn't let him cross. So the CIA and MI6 stepped in. They got rid of a democratic leader to put the monarch, the Shah, back on the throne. And right there, they planted the seeds of a deep-seated mistrust that would have disastrous consequences for decades to come.
So after the coup, the US and the Shah of Iran became inseparable. But this new powerful alliance came at a really steep price. For Washington, the Shah was a crucial piece on the chessboard, a bulwark against Soviet influence during the Cold War.
And this chart just perfectly illustrates the complete 180. Under the Shah, Iran was flooded with American weapons and money. The US even helped them get their nuclear program started. But for many, many Iranians, the US was just the foreign power propping up a brutal dictator. That resentment simmered and simmered until it finally boiled over in 1979, fueling an Islamic revolution that turned America from a key ally into the Great Satan.
That 1979 revolution and the embassy hostage crisis that followed, well, they locked both nations into a 40-year cycle of hostility. The 444 days that American diplomats were held captive in Tehran left a scar on the American psyche that has just never fully healed.
And the crucial thing to understand is that this wasn't just a static Cold War, it was a constant cycle of escalation. The US backed Saddam Hussein's Iraq against Iran in a horrific war. Iran fired back by supporting proxy groups like Hezbollah. The US countered with sanctions. And through it all, the biggest flashpoint became Iran's nuclear program. Now, we did get a brief thaw in 2015 with that big nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but that deal was abandoned by the US just 3 years later and replaced with a maximum pressure campaign of sanctions. It crippled Iran's economy, but it never changed their behavior. It just set the stage for an even bigger confrontation down the road.
And that ongoing cycle of conflict brings us right back to where we started. The year is 2026, and there's one final, doomed attempt at peace. The whole world was holding its breath, just hoping for a breakthrough that could pull everyone back from the brink of war.
With tensions at an absolute fever pitch, all eyes were on these negotiations in Pakistan. Diplomats had worked around the clock, they had secured a fragile ceasefire, all just to give diplomacy one last chance.
But just as the talks were supposed to begin, President Trump completely cancels the U.S. delegation's trip with this post on social media. The thinking seems to have been that this was a power move, that it projected ultimate strength, basically signaling that the U.S. held all the cards and wouldn't bend to international pressure.
Well, Iran's response was just as defiant. From their perspective, they couldn't possibly negotiate while under a U.S. naval blockade. It would look like a total surrender. President Pezeshkian's statement was a clear message to everyone that Iran would not be bullied. And just like that, the window for diplomacy slammed shut.
And this is why it suddenly mattered to every single person on the planet. In retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard had closed the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil choke point. This was their main leverage, a way to inflict pain back on the global economy. The economic fallout was immediate, and fuel prices skyrocketed worldwide.
The collapse of those talks was the final step on the road to a war that would reshape the Middle East. It leaves us with a critical question. After a century of mistrust and escalating conflict, could any other outcome have ever been possible? And maybe more importantly, what happens now that the unthinkable has finally occurred?